Racist cop hits black man, then shockingly learns he's actually her boss. The night was still, the kind of slow shift Officer Megan O'Connell didn't mind. The streets of Columbus were quiet past 10 p.m., with traffic reduced to the occasional passing car. She sat in her cruiser, parked near an empty lot, sipping on lukewarm coffee as the radio crackled with minor reports. Nothing serious, nothing that would make the night interesting. Her fingers drummed on the steering wheel, restless. Then she saw it. A sleek black sedan rolled through the intersection ahead, its polished exterior gleaming under the streetlights. It was the kind of car she'd never be able to afford on a cop's salary, the kind that made people take a second glance. Nothing about the vehicle itself stood out, except for one thing. No turn signal. A minor infraction, barely worth a second look, but it was enough. Technically, it was a violation. A reason. And sometimes that was all she needed. She set her coffee down, flicked on her cruiser's lights, and pulled onto the street. The sedan's brake lights flashed, and it glided smoothly to the curb without hesitation. Megan narrowed her eyes. That was fast. Too fast. No resistance. No panic. Something about that put her on edge. Stepping out, she adjusted her belt, one hand grazing her radio, the other resting near her holster. As she approached the driver's side window, she braced herself for the usual routine. Flustered excuses, fumbling for paperwork, stammering apologies. That's how it usually went, but this time, it didn't. The window rolled down with a slow, deliberate ease, revealing a man in his 40s, tall, clean-cut, wearing a tailored navy suit that fit his broad frame perfectly. His neatly trimmed beard and composed demeanor made him look like he had just walked out of a boardroom. His hands rested on the steering wheel, still and controlled, his fingers barely twitching. No nervous energy, no apologies, just waiting. Megan felt her chest tighten. She didn't like how he looked at her. Not fearful, not deferential, just calm. "License and registration," she said, sharper than necessary. The man blinked once, unbothered, then reached for his glove compartment. Slowly, controlled, like he already knew what she was thinking. "May I ask why I'm being stopped, officer?" His voice was deep, smooth, but not passive, even, balanced. Megan crossed her arms, her stance shifting. Failed to signal a turn back there. A beat passed, his breath was quiet, measured. Then he tilted his head slightly. "Did I?" The way he said it, not confrontational, not hostile, but challenging, irked her more than it should have. She felt heat rise in her neck. "License and registration," she repeated, her voice edged with impatience. The man complied without another word, his movements steady. No shaking hands, no rushed explanation, no nervous stammering. He handed over his ID and registration, and she barely glanced at the name before flipping it over. But that calm confidence, it unsettled her. It didn't fit the script. "You live around here?" she asked. The man exhaled through his nose. Not a sigh, but something close to it. "I don't see how that's relevant." Megan's grip on his ID tightened. She had been on the force for over a decade. Long enough to know when someone wasn't taking her seriously. Long enough to know when someone thought they could challenge her authority. Long enough to know when someone needed to be reminded who was in charge. "Step out of the vehicle," she ordered. For the first time, the man's expression shifted. His jaw tensed, his head tilting just slightly, like he was weighing something in his mind. "Why?" "I asked you to step out," she snapped. A muscle in his cheek twitched. But he didn't argue. He just sighed, unbuckled his seatbelt, and pushed the door open. Megan took a step back as he stood. Taller than she expected, broad-shouldered. There was no tension in his stance, no aggression, but something in his presence made her pulse quicken. She gestured toward the trunk, hands on the car. The man exhaled again, slow, deliberate, before turning and placing his palms flat against the cool metal. Megan's heart pounded. She could feel the shift now, the shift in power. This was her moment. She reached forward, pressing a hand against his back, guiding him down just slightly. He stiffened, and something inside her snapped. Before she even thought about it, before she even registered what she was doing, her palm struck his cheek. A sharp, stinging crack echoed in the empty street. The man's head jerked to the side. His body froze. Silence. Thick, heavy. Megan's own breath hitched. For a second, The world stood still. Then, slowly, too slowly, the man turned his head back to her. His face was unreadable. His jaw clenched just once before he took a steady breath. And then, in the most controlled, deliberate movement, he reached into his jacket pocket. Megan's stomach twisted. Was he? He pulled out his ID. Held it up. Chief of Police. Her superior. Megan's pulse roared in her ears. Her fingers went numb. The ground beneath her felt like it had cracked wide open. And standing right in front of her, Chief David Langston just watched. But this was far from over. Megan O'Connell sat in stunned silence, her heartbeat pounding in her ears, drowning out every other sound. Chief David Langston, not just any officer, not just a detective or some desk jockey from another precinct, her boss, stood before her, his face unreadable, his ID still held between his fingers. For a moment, the world refused to move. Then, with excruciating control, Langston tucked his badge away, adjusting his jacket like nothing had happened. He didn't yell, didn't demand an explanation. He just looked at her, and somehow, that was worse. Megan's stomach churned, her mind scrambled for an excuse, a justification, anything to take back what she had done. Chief, Langston raised a hand, a single calm gesture. Are you detaining me, Officer O'Connell? The question hit like a slap. Megan opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Her throat was dry. She glanced at her partner, Officer Sanders, who had arrived just in time to witness the tense exchange. His confusion was evident, his hand still resting near his belt. He had missed the moment Megan struck Langston. He didn't know. Langston's gaze never wavered. You heard me, officer, he said, his voice smooth, controlled, dangerous. Am I under detention? Megan swallowed. Her entire body felt frozen. No, sir, she finally managed. Langston exhaled slowly, as if confirming something to himself, then turned to Sanders, completely bypassing her. I assume you'll be handling the paperwork, Officer Sanders? Sanders hesitated, eyes darting between them. Yes, sir. Langston nodded once, then without another word, he stepped back into his car, shut the door, and pulled away, the black sedan disappearing into the night. Megan still hadn't moved. Sanders turned to her, brows furrowed. What the hell just happened? Her jaw clenched. Nothing. Sanders gave her a long look, clearly unconvinced. Didn't look like nothing. Megan turned away. Her hands were shaking. She shoved them into her pockets before Sanders could see. It's fine. I'll handle it. But it wasn't fine, not even close. Megan barely slept that night. She lay stiff in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment over and over. She had struck her boss, struck him, and he had let her walk away. No threats, no shouting, no immediate consequences. But the silence was worse. By morning, a single message awaited her from the precinct's internal affairs department. Report to the chief's office, immediately. Megan's stomach dropped. It was happening. She arrived at the station in silence, her grip stiff on the wheel. The moment she stepped inside, she felt the shift. Officers stood near the break room, heads turning just slightly. Some avoided her gaze, others whispered. They knew. Word always got around. The elevator ride felt like a death sentence. When she reached Langston's office, she barely had time to knock before Captain Bryant, Internal Affairs, opened the door. Inside, Langston sat at his desk flipping through a file. He didn't look up. Bryant crossed his arms. Officer O'Connell, take a seat. Megan's legs felt stiff as she sat. Langston finally lifted his eyes to hers. Then, in that same calm, even voice, he asked, Tell me, officer, how would you report last night's stop? And Megan knew this was only the beginning. Megan O'Connell sat stiff-backed in the chair, her hands gripping the armrests as if letting go would make her disappear. Across the desk, Chief David Langston sat with the same unreadable expression he had worn the night before. Captain Bryant of Internal Affairs stood to the side, arms crossed, his gaze locked onto her like a spotlight in an interrogation room. The air was thick, suffocating. Langston's fingers tapped once against the manila folder in front of him before he finally spoke. Tell me, Officer O'Connell, how would you report last night's stop? Megan swallowed. Her mouth was dry. She had rehearsed this, tried to find a way to frame it that didn't sound bad. But it was bad. She forced her voice to stay steady. Routine stop, failure to signal. Langston's brow lifted, his gaze never leaving her face. And Megan's stomach twisted. Say it. I escalated the situation, she admitted, each word feeling like it was being dragged from her throat. Langston nodded, like he had expected as much. Why? Megan's fingers dug into the fabric of her uniform pants. I felt he was being uncooperative. Bryant let out a quiet breath, something between a sigh and a scoff. Langston leaned forward, elbows on the desk, hands clasped together. Uncooperative? His voice was still controlled, but there was something behind it now, something sharp. Did I refuse to comply, Officer O'Connell? She hesitated. No, sir. Did I resist? Megan felt her throat close up. No, sir. Did I insult you? The weight of the question hit hard. She had wanted to feel justified in what she did, wanted to believe he had pushed her, even just a little. But no, Langston had been calm, measured, controlled. And that was why she had hit him. Because his lack of fear had frustrated her. Megan clenched her jaw. No, sir. Langston exhaled, leaning back slightly. He glanced at Bryant before sliding a single sheet of paper across the desk. Her stomach dropped. A suspension notice. Bryant's voice was firm, matter of fact. You're suspended for 60 days without pay. Additionally, you'll be required to attend de-escalation and bias training. Any future incident will result in termination. Megan's hands shook as she reached for the paper. Chief Langston, Langston stood up. Dismissed. The word wasn't necessary. Megan knew what it meant. She forced herself to stand, gripping the suspension notice so tightly it crumpled in her hand. As she turned toward the door, Langston's voice stopped her one last time. We're not done. She knew it was true. The real work hadn't even started yet. Megan O'Connell sat alone in her car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. 60 days. No pay, bias training, a mark on her record that she would never shake. It should have felt like a slap on the wrist, but somehow it felt heavier than that. Because deep down she knew she had gotten off easy. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat. She ignored it at first, assuming it was another colleague checking in, but when she glanced down, her breath caught in her throat. Chief David Langston. She hesitated, staring at the name, her pulse quickening. Why was he calling? She swallowed hard before finally pressing the answer button. Megan. A pause. Then Langston's voice, calm but firm. Meet me at Riverside Park, 10 minutes. The line went dead before she could ask why. Megan stared at her reflection in the rearview mirror. She didn't know what she expected. Anger, humiliation, maybe a final warning before he decided she wasn't worth keeping on the force. But he hadn't reported her himself. He wanted to talk. The park was nearly empty when she arrived. A few joggers, a man walking his dog, a couple on a bench. The streetlights flickered against the pavement, casting long shadows. And there he was. David Langston stood near the edge of the park, hands in his pockets, staring out at the river. He looked at ease. Not like someone who had been struck by one of his own officers the night before. Megan's legs felt stiff as she approached. You called me? She said, trying to keep her voice steady. Langston nodded, not looking at her. Do you know why I didn't report you to internal affairs myself? Megan hesitated. Because he wanted to handle it himself? Because he wanted to avoid a scandal? She swallowed. No, sir. Langston finally turned to face her, his expression unreadable. Because I wanted you to sit with it first. Feel it. Megan's chest tightened. I do. No, Langston said as if reading her mind. Not yet. He gestured toward a bench. Sit. It wasn't a request. Megan hesitated, but she sat. Langston followed, resting his elbows on his knees. You ever been pulled over, Megan? She blinked. What? A routine stop. Langston's eyes were still on the river. You ever had a cop flash their lights at you? Ask for your license? Ask where you were going? Megan frowned. I mean, maybe once or twice. Langston exhaled through his nose. I've lost count. A silence stretched between them. Every city I've lived in, he continued, his voice quiet but firm. I've had cops stop me, ask me why I was there, even in my own neighborhood. Megan felt her stomach turn. You hit me, Langston said, finally looking at her. Because you were frustrated. Her throat felt dry. But ask yourself why. Megan didn't answer. Langston didn't let her off the hook. Because I didn't act afraid of you. Her chest felt tight. You expected me to be nervous, to scramble for my wallet, to act like I was guilty of something. Langston's voice didn't rise, but the weight of his words pressed down on her. And when I didn't, when I stayed calm, that made you mad. Megan clenched her jaw. Langston tilted his head slightly. You don't see it, do you? You don't see how deep it runs. She gritted her teeth. I'm not. Langston cut her off. Not racist? He gave a humorless chuckle. Maybe not, but what do you call it when you assume someone's a threat just for existing? The words landed like a punch to the gut. Megan looked away, staring at the water. She wanted to defend herself, wanted to say something, anything, that would make this feel less awful. But there was no excuse. For the first time, she let herself sit with it. Langston stood. I didn't ask you here to tear you apart. I asked you here because you have a choice to make. Megan frowned. What choice? Langston turned toward her. His face was unreadable, but his voice carried the weight of something final. You can walk away from this and tell yourself it was just a mistake, he said. Or you can sit with it, really sit with it, and ask yourself why it happened. Megan's throat tightened. Langston took a step back. When internal affairs calls you back in, they're going to ask if you've learned anything. His gaze was sharp. Figure out what your answer is going to be. And just like that, he walked away. Megan sat there, staring at his retreating form, the night air pressing against her skin. For the first time, she wasn't fighting the truth. She was facing it. Megan O'Connell had spent the last 3 days drowning in silence. Her phone barely rang. No calls from the precinct, no texts from her usual work friends, no updates. It was as if she had been wiped clean from the department overnight. She should have been relieved, grateful for the time to think. But thinking was the problem. David Langston's words stuck to her like oil. You can walk away from this and tell yourself it was just a mistake. Or you can sit with it, really sit with it. She had told herself she wasn't that kind of cop, that she was different, fair. But that night had proved her wrong, and now the weight of it wouldn't let go. On the 4th day, the call finally came. Internal affairs, report in. Megan's hands were clammy as she gripped the wheel, driving to the station. The sun was out, but it did nothing to shake the chill in her gut. As soon as she stepped inside, she felt the eyes. Officers at their desks, a few glances exchanged in hushed conversations. They knew. She kept her head down as she made her way to the conference room. The door was already open. Inside, 3 people sat waiting. Captain Howard, an internal affairs investigator named Harris, and David Langston. He didn't look at her as she stepped in, just kept his hands folded on the table, staring at the file in front of him. Megan swallowed hard and sat. Harris leaned forward, flipping open the file. Officer O'Connell, let's talk about the stop from last week. Her throat was dry. Yes, sir, Harris nodded. According to your statement, you pulled the driver over for a failure to signal. Is that correct? Yes, sir. Harris flipped to another page. And at what point did you escalate to physical force? Megan's stomach twisted. She could feel Langston's presence across the table. His silence just as loud as the question itself. She swallowed. I struck the driver after asking him to step out of the vehicle. Why? The word landed hard. She had rehearsed this in her head 100 times. But every excuse, every justification, suddenly felt hollow. Her lips pressed together. I lost my temper. Captain Howard shifted in his chair. Harris's brow lifted slightly, like he hadn't expected her to say it so plainly. He flipped to another page. You wrote here that you felt the driver was being uncooperative. Megan's hands curled into fists under the table. She exhaled. I assumed he was resisting when he wasn't. For the first time, Langston looked up. Their eyes met. Assumed, he repeated. Megan felt the weight of that word. Silence stretched between them. Then Harris cleared his throat. Chief Langston, do you have anything to add? Langston sat back in his chair. He studied her for a moment, then exhaled. Not yet. Harris closed the file. Officer O'Connell, here's where we are. You've been on the force for 15 years with no prior disciplinary action. That works in your favor. However, this was an unjustified use of force. That's not something we can ignore. Megan felt her pulse pick up. Harris continued, you are looking at a minimum suspension of 60 days without pay. Additionally, you'll be required to attend de-escalation and bias training. A second offense of this nature will result in termination. Megan let out a slow breath. It wasn't good news, but it wasn't the end either. She nodded. Understood. Harris stood, gathering his files. "We'll finalize the paperwork. You're dismissed." Megan rose from her seat, but Langston didn't move. He watched her, his expression unreadable. Then, just as she reached the door, he finally spoke. "O'Connell?" She stopped. Langston's voice was calm, even, but there was no mistaking the weight behind it. "This isn't over." Megan didn't turn around. She just gripped the doorknob, forcing herself to breathe. Because deep down, she knew he was right. And the real work hadn't even started yet. Megan O'Connell sat in her car outside the station, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. 60 days. No pay. Bias training. It could have been worse. Should have been worse. She had expected anger, resentment, maybe even relief that she hadn't lost her job completely. But none of those emotions came. Instead, there was something heavier, something she had been avoiding since the moment David Langston locked eyes with her that night. Shame. She had assumed, she had reacted, she had abused her authority, and she had gotten away with a slap on the wrist. Langston was right. This wasn't over. The first day of training was humiliating. The room was small, packed with about a dozen officers, some rookies, some veterans like her. No one spoke much. No one wanted to be there. The instructor was a retired detective, Evelyn Carter, an older black woman with decades of experience and an expression that had seen it all. She scanned the room, then clicked the projector remote. A traffic stop video played. Megan watched in silence. The footage was grainy, taken from a body cam, but the story was clear. A black man pulled over for a minor infraction. The officer, white like her, escalated the situation. Voice sharp, tone clipped. The man kept his hands visible, his voice calm, but it didn't matter. The officer's frustration grew, tension rising. Then, physical force. The room stayed silent as the video ended. Evelyn crossed her arms. "Let's talk about assumptions." No one spoke. She let the silence stretch. Then her eyes landed on Megan. "O'Connell." Megan swallowed. "What did the officer see when he pulled that man over?" Megan knew the answer. She just didn't want to say it. "He saw a threat." Evelyn nodded. "And what did you see when you pulled over Chief Langston?" Megan's chest felt tight. She had told herself she wasn't racist, that she treated everyone the same. But that night had proven otherwise. She wet her lips, her voice barely above a whisper. "A threat." Evelyn tilted her head. "And was he?" Megan's stomach churned. "No." Evelyn studied her for a long moment, then a simple question that burned through her. Where did that idea come from? Megan didn't have an answer. Not yet. But for the first time, she wasn't looking away from the question. Evelyn nodded. Good. Megan let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, because for the first time since that night, she wasn't fighting the truth. She was facing it. 2 months later, Megan O'Connell walked back into the precinct. Everything felt the same, yet different. The station hummed with its usual noise, phones ringing, boots against tile, the low murmur of officers exchanging reports. But there was something in the air. When people saw her, not pity, not judgment, just watching, she didn't blame them. Megan had spent 60 days in suspension, 60 days sitting with the weight of her actions, the shame pressing against her chest like an iron vice. Bias training hadn't just been uncomfortable, it had been eye-opening. She had walked in skeptical, defensive, ready to argue that she wasn't like that. But the truth was, she had been, and now she had to own that. She made her way toward her desk, setting her things down. Before she could sit, a shadow passed by. David Langston. He didn't stop, didn't say anything, just walked toward his office. But then, right at the door, he hesitated, turned his head slightly. "O'Connell," she stiffened. "Sir?" A pause. Then, 2 simple words. "Welcome back." Megan swallowed. "Thank you." Langston nodded once, then stepped inside his office, shutting the door behind him. She stood there for a long moment, staring at the closed door. That was it. No speech, no warning, no lecture, just a second chance. And for the first time in weeks, she breathed. Prejudice isn't always loud. It doesn't always come with slurs or open hatred. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's just assumptions. Split-second decisions based on nothing but fear and conditioning. The question isn't whether or not it exists. The question is, what will you do about it?